Good evening, Professor Netta Barak-Corren from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It's a pleasure to have you with us and to publish your work. And we'll start with your one of two papers that you are publishing with us, regulating, and the title of the paper is Regulating for Integration by Behavioral Design, an evidence-based approach for culturally responsive regulation. So thank you for coming again, and can you please tell us briefly what the paper is about?
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me and for publishing my work in regulation and governance. This is such a great venue and such engaged readership, and I'm just honored to publish this work in regulation and governance. And I think that the paper tackles a problem which is of growing importance in today's world. Many societies around the world, democratic, liberal governments, face the challenge of multiculturalism, and particularly strengthening social integration against the backdrop of increased cultural diversity. And one of the main obstacles to achieving a level of social integration, social cohesion, social trust in a very multicultural world is that often regulations for social integration encounter substantial resistance. So we have several examples that we can think of, from cultural assimilation policies to common core education programs that have encountered from objection to actual backlash among the very groups that the regulator strives to integrate into society. And the key question that this paper asks is, how can the regulation for integration be improved in circumstances of cultural tensions? And because this is a fundamental challenge, I think, then we really need to think about it from an interdisciplinary perspective, or at least this is my argument, that we have tried lots of things and lots of things did not work. So let's try to expand the way we look at it.
Thank you, Netta. So if I got it right, regulation is political because society is political, and when you recognize political differences, you have to adapt your regulation to multicultural situations. And even practical, even if you don't recognize the multiculturalism, you have to give practical, to make practical consideration into your calculations, how to approach resistance from different groups. So what is the specific empirical problem that you have dealt with? I mean, you did a case study of the Israeli society. Can you tell us what was the problem there, the specific one?
Sure. So the study looks at this broader question through the specific case study of Israeli core curriculum regulation, which is a key integration through education policy that essentially mandates that all primary schools in Israel teach a basic portfolio of general education subjects, for example, including language, math, sciences, social studies, of course, in addition to the school's chosen curriculum. And the aim of such policies, by the way, all over the world, is to cultivate some kind of shared foundations among all citizens. And this is important for various reasons, right? I mean, we want a society that is able to have some kind of shared social foundations and basic levels of trust and cooperation. We also want to improve the prospects of social and economic integration for all groups, and to allow all children some kind of basic fertile ground for personal prosperity. But this kind of a regulation, although it's very common around the world, also experiences significant backlash and resistance from insular cultural groups of varying sizes and minority groups of different cultural backgrounds that feel that common core curricula or general education threatens their worldviews. And in the Israeli case study, I'm specifically studying the very resistant attitudes of ultra-Orthodox in Israel towards the regulation. So maybe a few words on ultra-Orthodox in Israel. The ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel are, on the one hand, part of the Jewish majority, but they're a specific and distinct minority group in Israel. They have very insular lifestyle. They have their own educational institutions. It's very important for the leaders to keep the society segregated and insulated from general society. Very low participation in the workforce, and ultra-Orthodox schools, particularly schools for boys, avoid teaching most of the common core curricula due to their resistance to this policy. And this, of course, creates a very big issue for regulators that seek to achieve better integration. And as I find in my study, and I'll say more about it in a second, this also creates obstacles for ultra-Orthodox students themselves and ultra-Orthodox families and ultra-Orthodox institutions. So just to go back to the broader level of the argument for a second, I mean, if we regulators, scholars, and maybe more broadly regulators, if we don't study the behavioral decision-making processes, the sociological and structural settings in which decisions, whether to accept or not, whether to implement or not these policies, if we don't study those settings and understand how decisions are being made, then the possibility of making the regulation for integration effective, the prospects of effectiveness are really slim. And what I argue is that we don't do that often enough. And if we're serious about ideas such as responsive regulation or behavioral insights in regulation, we really need to do that more, also in the setting of regulation for integration and multicultural regulation more generally. So
Shall I
go ahead?
Shall I ask? So if I got it right, we have a very powerful minority, but very politically powerful group, the ultra-Orthodox. They don't want to study mathematics, and then the question is, and this goes for years and years. It's not a new problem, and this group is growing in size. And the issue is really problematic. It's a wicked problem. And we cannot solve it politically so far in Israel. So what is your contribution?
So what I do is that I integrate both behavioral insights at the theoretical level, and then I go ahead and study this and test this empirically. So the first part of the project is really grounded in field research. So I went ahead and I interviewed ultra-Orthodox principals, so leaders of religious schools for boys, educators, both in the formal and the informal education, people who head and administer and superintend ultra-Orthodox education system, and I interviewed them about this problem. And what I find there is that there's this ambivalence, really interesting dual approach towards the common core curricula. So on the one hand, very, very clearly, this regulation is perceived as threatening core values for ultra-Orthodox society. It's against a lot of what the system wishes to inculcate in the students. On the other hand, principals and administrators do recognize that it has pedagogical and academic advantages for their students. So they also view it as an asset. They recognize that the tools, the practical tools, can help students in life. But it's hard to reconcile the fact that on the one hand, it's threatening the idea of insularity and the sacredness of religious studies, and on the one hand, and the other hand, the fact that it's an asset. And actually, the key idea that I'm then going ahead to test experimentally came from principals themselves. So principals were very much sensitive to how the government, to how regulators talk about the policy. And they said often, they said, if only the government would have talked differently about the policy, if it wouldn't have presented it as the most important thing that students should study, if it would have just talked about it in more mundane terms as something that's additive to religious studies and not the key core part of education program, then we think they could have been much more simpler to bite the bullet on it and to implement it in our schools. And I just thought that it's a super interesting idea from everything we know in social psychology and cognitive psychology about those two concepts of, first, identity threat, which is a very renowned concept in psychology and social psychology about how people really react negatively to policies and to suggestions that threaten their basic core ideological values. And on the other hand, from cognitive psychology, we learned from the foundational work of Kahneman and Tversky that people react differently to different frames of the very same policy. So what I do is that I marry those two insights and I go ahead and do two field experiments, or more correctly, two lab in the field experiments. So I expand. So if in the qualitative part of the field work, I interviewed principals of religious schools, in the experimental part, I expand the sample and I sample big samples of community members, the vast majority of our parents, so ultra-Orthodox parents. And I conduct two decision-making experiments, an original experiment and then a replication and expansion of the same idea, where I randomly allocate participants to either read and respond to the regulation in its original form, which is identity threatening, or in a framed form, which is meant to affirm their identity. And here I implement a key insight in social psychology. So social psychologists have been mapping identity threats phenomena for years, and they've also been developing interventions to tackle these phenomena. And one of the key ideas behind the intervention is that identity threat often interferes with our decision-making processes. And if you want to buffer individuals against identity threats and allow them to make decisions, allow them the space to make decisions that are free from the threat, then you need to affirm their identity in advance. So what I do is that I create an identity affirming framing. And it's very simple. It changes nothing. So my two experimental conditions are virtually identical in terms of the incentives, both the benefits and the costs, the potential sanctions of regulation. They change nothing about the legal background, but the identity affirming framing uses those insights from principles of just speaking of the same thing as additive to holy studies, and does not interfering with otherwise the autonomous management of the school. And I just document in two experiments a very significant and also substantially large jump in the support and also personal willingness to have my children study the core curriculum among ultra-Orthodox parents. So
Excellent.
This is the core of the empirical findings.
Excellent. So what can we take from this case study and from your approach to the larger understanding of regulation in social context where there is cultural differences between regulator and regulatee? What are the implications of the study?
Right. So I think there are straightforward implications, and then there are also more expansive theoretical implications. So first, the straightforward implications is, I think, for regulators that tackle with multicultural issues and multicultural tensions and seek to implement regulations for integrations, then the study offers some new tools, both methodological tools and also insights to apply to make the regulation for integration better, more effective, less conflictual, less controversial, and more responsive to the characteristics of the groups that the regulators seek to integrate. So that's straightforward, and I talk quite a lot about that in the discussion section. I also think that there are more broader theoretical insights that we can take from this study. So I think first, regulators, and particularly, of course, the audience, the readership of regulation and governance, have been thinking really deeply for many years about regulation as a responsive framework, where regulators need to be responsive to the characteristics of regulators, need to understand causes and motivations for non-compliance, and adapt the regulatory response accordingly. And I think that this is a really fundamental framework for thinking about regulation, but this framework really was not adapted so far to multicultural challenges, and more broadly for settings in which our regulators, our rule takers, are groups that have not just rational or irrational motivations for compliance, but also cultural, ideological, value-based, value-driven motivations for non-compliance. So the study, it opens a new, I think, research agenda of first studying individual regulators, unlike business regulators, which much of the literature, or industry regulators that much of the literature has tackled so far. But today we live in a world where regulators really sometimes want to engage with individual rule takers. So first, I mean, both methodologically and theoretically, I think that the study takes us one step further there. And then also, when regulators need to regulate cultural worldviews or groups, then again, the study offers concrete directions to take in that perspective. And then I think there is also even broadening our lens a little bit even beyond that. Then we can think about the problem more generally. What do regulators do when regulation conflicts with ideological worldviews? It doesn't have to be culture, right? I mean, today we see regulators around the world, health regulators, dealing with ideological, sometimes opposition, for example, to the uptake of coronavirus vaccines, right? So how do regulators deal with that? Current literature says very little about it. I think this research provides a framework for thinking about how regulators should tackle and deal with ideologically driven opposition to regulation. They need to understand this opposition as driven potentially by identity threat, and they can adapt methods from both social psychology and cognitive psychology to engage with this threat, to affirm individuals against this feeling of identity threat, and to respectfully engage with their values, and that creates a much more potentially effective way to tackle this resistance than command and control, classic command and control approaches, or simply, you know, calling people to get vaccination without actually dealing with what drives the resistance to vaccination.
Thank you very much, Netta. Excellent paper, and congratulations for the presentation. The paper itself available online in the Regulation and Governance Journal, and we'll see you again with us, Netta. So thank you very much for now.
Thank you very much.